I'm Doug Maitland. I'm in the ODOT Office of Real Estate, and we are on Module 1 of an 11 module series covering the Value Finding Appraisal Report. We're going to cover Module 1 right now, which is the acquisition process using the Value Finding Appraisal. The Value Finding Appraisal Report is an appraisal report. It's USPAP compliant, that's Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. It's used when there's an uncomplicated valuation problem that exceeds the limits of a waiver valuation, and the limits of compensation for the value finding is $65,000 or less. As it's an appraisal, it requires an appraisal review. The value finding is an integral part of estimating compensation, so an offer can be made to the owner and ODOT can obtain control of the rights of way needed for the highway project. Now, the differences between the value finding and the VA, there's several. The value finding is on the left, the value analysis is on the right. As we discussed before, the value finding is an appraisal, where the value analysis is not. It's a waiver of appraisal. With a value finding, accompaniment is offered to the property owner by the appraiser. Accompaniment is not offered with a value analysis. A VF has to be reviewed. With a value analysis, the review is optional. And again, with the VF, compensation is $65,000 or less, and with the value analysis, it's $10,000 or less. So before the value finding appraisal can even be started, ODOT must have a qualified person prepare the appraisal. So people who can prepare the value finding is regulated by Ohio Administrative Code and federal regulation 49 CFR Part 24. And they regulate who ODOT can use for appraisals and appraisal reviews. The agency has criteria for minimum qualifications and competency of appraisers and review appraisers. That comes right out of the code. Agency must review the qualifications of those who seek appraisal and review approval status with ODOT. And the agency can only use those determined as qualified. Fee appraisers are required to be state licensed or certified. If they're not, we cannot use them. ODOT staff who are qualified to prepare the value finding. Pre-approval to prepare is by the appraisal manager, Office of Real Estate, and Jared Miller is that person. He will document by letter who's qualified and who isn't. And approved staff are going to be listed on the Office of Real Estate webpage. And to stay approved, ODOT staff must take continuing education courses to the level that is required of a state certified real estate appraiser, which is 14 hours of continuing educational courses every year that is approved by the Ohio Department of Commerce. All of this is in detail in our real estate manual, and that section is 4000.09. So the qualification standards for staff to become approved are, and again, this comes right out of our manual. They've got to take a variety of courses, which will include the ODOT Appraisal 108 course, which is the 15-hour USPAP course. They have to take basic appraisal principles, basic appraisal procedures, real estate finance statistics and valuation modeling, general appraiser site valuation and cost approach, and the sales comparison approach. Consultants qualified to prepare the value finding, they've got to be licensed or certified as issued by the Ohio Department of Commerce. This licensure is required by the Ohio Revised Code, Section 4763, and that code limits the type of properties that these certified people can appraise. So state licensed real estate appraisers are limited to residential only, up to 4 units for non-complex assignments, up to $1 million. And for complex assignments, they're limited to residential up to $250,000. What this means is if we have a vacant site, you cannot use a state licensed real estate appraiser because they're not allowed to appraise vacant sites per the code. State certified residential real estate appraisers, only residential up to 4 units, no limit on value. State certified general real estate appraisers, there are no restrictions, and whatever they appraise must be USPAP compliant, and they have to comply with the USPAP competency provision. Consultants must be pre-approved by the ODOT Office of Consultant Services. The submittal requirements are in the consultant pre-qualification requirements of procedures. On our website, go to right-of-way acquisition services, then go to 2.36 appraisal, then the submittal requirements, and that gets you to page 43. And this is what it looks like. So a consultant has to provide a detailed resume, and that resume needs to relate to work history and experience relative to eminent domain appraisal. 2, got to talk about the number of years of experience they have in appraisal. 3, they've got to talk about their affiliations in professional organizations. 4, they got to talk about the types of property appraised in any specialty areas. 5, they need to discuss their experience in providing expert testimony in eminent domain cases. 6, they've got to give us samples of their work that demonstrate their ability to estimate compensation using a before and after analyses. And 7, they've got to give us a copy of their current appraisal certificate or license. This information will then be reviewed, and if it's determined to meet the ODOT standards, that person may be placed on the pre-approved list of consultants who can prepare appraisals for the Ohio Department of Transportation. There's also pre-approved lists for LPA staff who can prepare the value finding report. There are approved lists for appraisal review, and under appraisal review, we also have other categories, which will be ODOT staff, consultants, and LPA staff. So moving on, number 2, ODOT must assure the appraisal scoping checklist is completed prior to the appraiser starting the value finding appraisal report. A completed appraisal scoping checklist means that that form is filled out and signed by all parties, and that's required by ODOT procedure. And all parties include the district real estate administrator, the review appraiser, and the appraiser who's going to actually be preparing the value finding appraisal report. The appraisal scoping checklist is going to document that the parties agree about what the valuation problem is. It rates the valuation problem as complicated or uncomplicated, and it determines if it's obvious that the compensation will probably be less than $65,000. And it determines that the value finding appraisal report is the appropriate format to use. The purpose of the checklist is to comply with the regulation, requiring the agency to assist in contributing to the appraisal process by defining the appraisal problem, by developing the scope of work needed that is necessary for that appraisal problem, and to assure that the appraisals it receives are relevant to its program's needs. All right, we are now entering the first knowledge check.